it was felt that there is a need for us to have a better understanding of services where they are safety related or safety critical and how they might need to be assured. And the goal of the Service Assurance Working Group was to develop guidance on the assurance of such services. But it was also a secondary aim of the working group, having developed the guidance, and it's version 3.1 published last week on the SCSC website, that we should actually look at how we could apply that guidance into a real world scenario. About 12 months ago, in one of our working group meetings, the subject of services across boundaries came into being. And that's not just across kind of physical boundaries, but it's boundaries between service providers where a complex system might have services provided by multiple different organizations. And that led to, well, what about the Mont Blanc tunnel and the fire in the Mont Blanc tunnel? Just got to say the point up there on the side, the information that's available in the public domain is quite limited on this. So a lot of the analysis that we did for this paper is based upon hypotheses that we've had to come to from our expert knowledge of services, but with limited understanding of the Mont Blanc tunnel. The one benefit we had is Fatty at the bottom here. He's a specialist in ventilation systems in road tunnels, so we were able to call upon his expertise. It's also clear to point out that the analysis is our work and it's not representative of the companies that we work for. Okay, so I'll give you a brief introduction on service analysis for those who aren't aware of it. I'm then going to run through the accident, what happened on that fateful day and the lead up to it, and some of the characteristics of the tunnel. Then go through some of the analysis that we undertook for the service analysis of the accident. There's a lot more detail in the paper. I'm only going to cover some of it this afternoon because obviously time is limited. And then at the end, I'm going to reflect on some of the future work that we think will be relevant. Okay, so what is a service? It's very difficult, and we've been working at this for about 6 years now. We have not been able to define what do you mean by a service, okay? Rather than actually defining a term for service, and if you look at our guidance document, there are about 5 different definitions of service from the defence standards, the health standards, and others. It's more important for us to understand the characteristics of the service. And if you look at the diagram on the left here, you'll see that each service, and we can be fairly clear about this, will have a provider. Each service will have a consumer. There will be some form of definition of what that service is. There will be some kind of agreement, what we call a service level agreement, and there will be some form of contractual obligation, a service contract. And that will be in a hierarchy where you might have a service provider and sub-service providers beneath that. Now, it is our view that where those services are in any way safety related or safety critical, and there's a lot of those that we can categorize, that we need to assure them. So there is a need for service assurance. And to assure that service, you need to understand the functionality that that service provides. And if we look at that in the context of the Mont Blanc tunnel, the rationale for our analysis of the tunnel is actually services are often a transaction that doesn't involve a physical asset changing hands. So a user of the Mont Blanc tunnel, and I could ask how many people in the room have travelled through the Mont Blanc tunnel? Okay, a few hands. Okay. When you travel through the tunnel, what are you using? You're using the service the tunnel provides, a road, lighting, signage, ventilation, but there is no exchange of a physical asset as part of that provision. So what happened on that fateful day? Well, let's give you a bit of the background. So the characteristics of the tunnel, first considered to be a possibility in the late 1900s. 2 world wars later, and it became a reality in the late 1940s. The first drilling occurred in 1959 and the tunnel opened in 1965. When it opened, in the Eagle, Boys Own magazine, they presented this cutout image on the left here of what they styled as the world's longest shortcut. It took about 1,200 kilometers off of the route from Paris to Rome by going through the tunnel. The tunnel, it's about 7 meters wide. It's one of the narrowest tunnels of its ilk, single carriageway, no central reservation. It is also 2,000 meters, 2 kilometers below the summit of Mont Blanc, and through the length of the tunnel, there are no ventilation shafts going up into the outside world. So all the ventilation for the tunnel, that's fresh air going into the tunnel and exhaust fumes being extracted from the tunnel, goes through these passageways that you can see in the diagram underneath the tunnel. So if you look at the diagram on the right, that's actually the surface of the roadway, and obviously you can see the tunnels underneath. So if you think about the operational characteristics of the tunnel, when it was first built, they had an expectation of the number of vehicles that would use it. And they had a growth plan for that. By 1999, there were twice as many road vehicles in terms of cars and motorbikes using the tunnel than they had a plan for at that point. More importantly, there was a 17-fold increase in heavy goods vehicle traffic using the tunnel. Another factor, both entrances to the tunnel are about 1,700 meters above sea level. The road network to get to that point on each side is quite a steep climb. So heavy goods vehicles carrying heavy loads would be exerted quite a bit of effort to get to that point where they would enter into the tunnel. Okay. Once vehicles are in the tunnel, there was an expectation it would be a 70-kilometer-an-hour speed limit, and that vehicles would be kept 100 meters apart. However, there was no requirement, if vehicles were stationary, that vehicles had to maintain that distance. So when vehicles became stationary, the gaps were closed up. So the timeline. So the truck, use that term. So there is a Belgian heavy goods vehicle traveling through into Italy, carrying 12 tons of flour, 9 tons of margarine, and importantly, 550 litres of fuel, diesel. And the trailer unit was made of this isothermal foam, which was lovely and combustible. So it enters the tunnel. After about 6 minutes, other road users notice there's smoke coming from the engine of the truck, and they start warning the truck by flashing their headlights. This is oncoming traffic. At the same time, an obscuration detector is activated in the French control center, and the screens show smoke. Importantly, that's the French control center, because there was a separate control center on the Italian side of the tunnel. The tunnel is 11.6 kilometers. 2/3 of the tunnel sits in French territory, 1/3 in Italian territory. When it opened, it was agreed that half of the tunnel will be managed by the French and half will be managed by the Italians. And they set up separate management companies to manage each of their halves of the tunnel, and separate control centers. And the two control centers were not communicating. The driver leaves his truck, and the French control center didn't see the fact that they had smoke on their screens as an issue, because they'd seen it before, loads of times. People get out of their vehicles, fight a fire, and then the rescue truck comes along and tows them away. So they didn't do anything. The driver started to fight the fire, and then his engine exploded. Nearby drivers at that point had left their vehicles, and the cars had concertinaed up because there was no mechanism to make sure they maintained a 100-meter distance between themselves. And they had, in the infrastructure of the tunnel, they had refuges that you could go into to be safe. Okay, so the drivers went into these refuges, and there was a phone in there, so they raised the alarm through the phone. At the same time, tunnel employees who were working in the tunnel also triggered the fire alarm. And it was that caused the French authorities to close the tunnel. By 11 o'clock, other vehicles' engines had started to stall. And actually, I haven't got it on the diagram here, but the driver of the truck, when his engine exploded, he decided to get out of there. He was heading towards the Italian end, so he fled out of the tunnel towards the Italian end. Okay. He was prosecuted, but let off after the event. So by 11 o'clock, a number of vehicles, because of the amount of exhaust fumes that were building up in the tunnel and the lack of oxygen, they were starting to have engine failure. And some of the drivers started to seek refuge in these refuges. Unfortunately, not the best solution as it turned out. At that time, 2 crews from Chamonix in France attended the scene. Actually, they attended the French end of the tunnel. The first engine decided to go into the tunnel. The second one thought, well, we'll wait and see what we get feedback from our colleagues. They didn't get very far. Come to that in a moment. And at the same time, separately, the Italians had been made aware, and a fire crew from Courmayeur in Italy were sent. 10 minutes later, the second Italian fire crew arrived, and they stationed themselves at the Italian entrance. So the first crew had got something like almost 3 kilometers from the truck fire before they were pushed back by not just the intense smoke, but actually the heat as well. There was quite a buildup of heat. With no ventilation shaft heading upwards, it was an issue. The first Italian crew, another 5 minutes after that, they abandoned their truck. They got quite close to the truck, but they had to abandon and seek refuge. Oh, why did that not? The second Italian crew abandoned their vehicle and they went in search on foot. Actually, they went in search of their colleagues in the first Italian fire truck, not for any survivors from the incident, but they were more concerned about their colleagues. 11:30, so we're over half an hour after the fire started now, and the second crew only reached 5 kilometers or so from the truck, again because of the smoke and the heat. And it was a full hour after the fire started that employees in the tunnel instigated a rescue mission. And that used the air channels that I spoke about earlier that run underneath the road surface. That did save some lives, but it took them 6 hours to enact that. The doors on the rescue shelters that the people that had come out of the cars were being held in, those doors had a fire rating of about 3 hours. So a further hour on, the French emergency plan was activated. Note the French emergency plan, not the emergency plan, because the Italians had a separate emergency plan. Okay. That took another half an hour before they instigated their red plan, and that was primarily to rescue the workers that had gone in, not necessarily anybody that was left in a car. By 6 p.m., 6 civilians have been saved from the refuges, and by the Friday, this is the Wednesday, by the Friday, the fire was finally under control. 52 hours before they could get the fire under control. It reached 1,000 degrees centigrade in the tunnel, and it took 5 days from when the fire was put out before the tunnel, right in the middle of the tunnel, was cool enough to them to go in and get any of the debris out and recover any of the bodies. Okay, 38 people died in their vehicles, 15 minutes. Most of them died within 15 minutes of the fire. So 38 people died. One of the Italian fire crew, the Italian fire captain, he passed away subsequently in hospital. 14 of the Italian fire crew were actually rescued. That's the tunnel. That's the aftermath of the image of it. So, service analysis, that's what we're here to talk about. So why did that tunnel fire happen? Why did all of the complications around it, why did it take them so long to get in there? So we think about this from the context of the services that were in place to support the operation of that tunnel. And using the guidance that we've developed in our guidance document, we can look at a hierarchy of the services that we believe are in place. Now, as I said at the beginning, we haven't got a huge amount of evidence out there in the public domain for us to be able to analyze it in great detail. So we've had to hypothesize some of the services. But we've come up with this service hierarchy. So the important thing is that we are fairly confident that, albeit they were managed separately, the services on the Italian side, that's SITMB service, that's their company, and the services on the French side, ATMB, were identical in their hierarchy. And that's why in our diagram here, we've only got the French side in detail. The Italian side, we believe, would be replicated this. 2 techniques that we've drawn on from our guidance document. The first one is around understanding the level of assurance that you need for the services that are provided, what we are calling a level of service assurance. So there are 5 levels of service assurance. A service that is at LSA 0 is a service which we feel has no real safety aspect to it or safety criticality to it, right the way through an LSA 4 service, which is clearly safety critical, and if it fails, could likely lead to a catastrophic impact and potentially fatalities. Okay. So we've applied that to our diagram, and we can overlay levels of service assurance to each of the services in the hierarchy. Importantly, it is our view that a lower level service will drive a higher level service. So a higher level service, if we look at the ventilation service, that's level 4. The parent service, tunnel operations service, is also level 4. So the tunnel operations service can only be at an LSA of level 4 if one of its children is at that high level. So a high level of service, level of service assurance drives the parent level of service assurance. So that gives us an understanding of which of the services are critical and need more assurance. And the second construct that we've applied is what we call wrappers. So this is understanding how complete the assurance evidence is for a given service. So some of the services we can be confident will have a good understanding of service in the service provider and assurance of that service by the service provider. Others may be more generic. So the drainage maintenance service, it's our view that that's probably a fairly generic service that might be used in other constructs that aren't as safety critical as they are in the tunnel. So the context of a wrapper and the requirement for a wrapper is to enable the service consumer to have confidence in the assurance of the service that they are consuming. If they are consuming a service where there is clear assurance evidence from the service provider, that's great. If there isn't that body of evidence there, they need to develop a wrapper to assure themselves of the appropriate level of evidence that they need that that service is going to be safe. So, after the fire, so the fire's happened. Our view is, if we go back, actually, if I just go back to this diagram, the fact that there are 2 halves to the service provision, the French half and the Italian half, there is clear evidence that the 2 sides didn't communicate. They didn't communicate on the day. Actually, beforehand, they didn't communicate. Investment in the tunnel was very much the French found money to invest, the Italians didn't, and vice versa. So when it came to improvements in the tunnel, there was not very good communication about what improvements were applied. There were also legislative issues. So we've got in the middle here, tunnel safety regulations as a service. There were French legislative requirements that were placed on the French side. 1, they were obsolete, and 2, they didn't tell the Italians. So the Italians had no service requirements in terms of legislation to comply with, and they weren't told about the French side. So after the fire, a lot changed. From a services perspective, a single body was created. So the tunnel reopened in 2002. A lot of work went into the tunnel in the intervening 3 years after the fire. They created this joint body, GEI-TMB, as it says at the bottom here, and that is 50% owned by the Italian company and 50% owned by the French company, and governed by both. The service provision, all the services are the same, it's just they are governed by a single body. So what services do we now have in the tunnel? So the 2 control rooms that weren't talking to each other, that were completely separate, those 2 control rooms still exist, but there is now a mechanism in place where there is a primary control room and a secondary control room. And at any one time, one control room has primacy. If there is an incident, they have primacy over the whole tunnel. There are a vast number, I won't read through them all, but on the diagram here, there are a vast number of improvements. The doors to the refuges now have over 24 hours of fire safety protection built in. There are now many more lights through the tunnel. The traffic signals are much more frequent. There are more refuges. Each refuge that people can go into now has video contact directly with the control centres, which wasn't there before. Now, we can accept that technology's moved on and there are technological improvements, but actually there are a number of issues with the services that could have been thought about and should have been thought about before the accident was allowed to happen. There is a statement in the accident report that they were prioritising because they hadn't had an accident in the tunnel since a major accident since it opened in 1965. So they were prioritising the throughput of vehicles. And they were allowing too many vehicles to go through the tunnel. Another improvement, a huge improvement, I'll come on to in a minute, is how they manage goods vehicles. Equally, if you've been through the tunnel recently, you almost certainly would have had one of these. They give everybody one of these things that you can hang on your wing mirror, on your interior mirror. On the green side, those are the rules that you have to comply with if you're traveling through the tunnel. On the red side, what you should do if you're in an accident. It's really good, it's really useful, it's succinct, it's pointed. Yes, there's a bit of French and Italian on there, but a lot of it is imagery, so there's no kind of language issue there. So if us Brits, because we don't talk French and Italian, are going through the tunnel, actually we can understand what it's telling us. So where do we go from here? So the main points of failure, in our view, in the services that were supporting the tunnel, there are 6 things that we really have concern about. As I've kind of emphasised throughout, there was a lack of communication between the French and Italian sides. And that wasn't just between the control rooms, that was also between the French fire service and the Italian fire service. They weren't coordinated. So the rescue attempts weren't coordinated. Okay. They had emergency plans in France. They had an emergency plan in Italy. They had 2 different plans in France and 1 in Italy. They weren't joined up. They were very disjointed. A further issue was the increase in traffic flow through the tunnel. There was no understanding of the traffic flow versus the requirement for clean air to support engines working efficiently and to evacuate all of the exhaust fumes that were being produced in the tunnel. The refuge areas, as I've said, there was no real means of contact to the control rooms. Yes, there were phones, but they weren't very good. There were also issues on safe escape. There was no means, if you went into a refuge, of getting out of that refuge through some kind of independent tunnel. And the bottom 2 here, there were no real checks on the materials that were being taken through the tunnel. If hazardous materials, and in this context, margarine was a hazardous material, if they were being taken through the tunnel, what checks were the operators doing on those? What service were they providing to check those tunnels were not going to cause a hazard during their transit through the tunnel? And actually, as it turns out with the vehicle, the truck that caused the fire, there were no checks on the mechanical state of the vehicles. So where are we now? Well, as I've said, there is a joined up approach to the control centres. There's now 1 control centre that takes primacy at any one time. There are joined up overarching joint emergency response plans in place. They even have a fire station in the middle of the tunnel. They've taken a chunk out of the rock wall and they've built in a fire station. Because the tunnel is only 7 metres wide, the fire engine is double-headed. Press a button and they can drive that way, press a button or pull a lever and it drives that way. They don't have to turn it around in the tunnel. It's a double-headed fire engine, really useful. They have a much better understanding of traffic flow versus the airflow capacity. There is an additional tunnel that's been put in under the surface of the road specifically for clean air. There is also a separate tunnel now, moving on to the last one on the top row there, that links all of the refuge areas as an evacuation tunnel and also for access for the emergency services to get in without needing to go through the main tunnel itself. And there is a separate airflow for anybody that is using that tunnel. And then on the bottom here, there is much greater assurance of the materials being carried because now on each side, some distance away from the entrance to the tunnel, they have an HGV park. So any vehicles, HGV vehicles coaches, buses that are going through the tunnel are required to go to this park. They get inspected, they get checked for their mechanical state, and their goods carried get checked. They also use that to moderate the flow of traffic, particularly HGV traffic through the tunnel. So they know, have a much better handle on the traffic that's flowing through them. So just very quickly, just where do we go now? As I've said, we've had limited evidence to build this upon, so it is hypothetical, our research, but valuable. Please go away, read the paper. Our view is that there's a couple of really good places where we should be directing our influence, and I would like to think we will be able to offer our services to the Stonehenge Road Tunnel, which is in the offing, and the Lower Thames Crossing in Essex into Kent and vice versa. There is also the proceedings paper. So as I say, read that, and there is our guidance document. That's version 3. That's the cover of version 3. As I say, last week version 3.1 came online on the website. And actually, the last thing on here, there's about 6 of us that are regular attendees at the Service Assurance Working Group. If you are working in product safety, you are working in service assurance, my view. But if you're interested, come and speak to me, come and speak to Mike Parsons. We have a number of people that are active in this, but we could do with more. So, take away. Services underpin every safe product delivery. Understanding the full scope of the services and their assurance is absolutely paramount. And it's not easy, but absolutely we have to be assuring the services that we deliver. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Any questions for Kevin?
I should have said, if they're difficult questions, Mike's.
I don't think this is difficult. I'm Ben Bradshaw from ZF. Is the safety group, is the safety assurance working group satisfied with the current state of the tunnel in terms of the service?
But it's interesting because I posed the question. So my co-authors, Mike Parsons, everyone knows. James Catmer, his specialism is in roads and highways. I'll be careful, but I'm going to say it. He's part of the co-authorship of the Smart Motorway Safety Case in the UK. Okay, so don't ask me, ask him if you're concerned about smart motorways. But and Fatty, as I said earlier, his specialism is ventilations in tunnels. I posed the question because it was posed to me by someone in my business before Christmas. What accidents have happened in the tunnel since 2002 when it reopened? Is it genuinely now much safer than it was? There's no evidence out there to say it isn't, but so there hasn't been a major accident in the tunnel. So you would like to think that the measures that have now been put in place are appropriate. Could they improve it by understanding and applying our guidance? Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, can I just come in? I think the thing is, though, it's a bit like the Grenfell situation, that you actually have to look at all your existing tunnel infrastructure. Even in the UK, there's some very old tunnels, road, rail tunnels, some of them probably, a century old, I think. Would they actually meet any of these current requirements? How are they managed? How are the services delivered?
Where I live down on the south coast, I'm a regular user of the Hindhead Tunnel on the A3. And I think, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, that's the longest road tunnel we have in the UK at the moment. I use that regularly and I don't have a concern, but is that because I'm kind of naive because there hasn't been an accident in that tunnel, or is it genuinely safe? I'll pose that and leave that question.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll invite Alistair to the stage.